Hi, my name is Angelus, and I would like to welcome you back to the podcast Let's Finish the Thought. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a philosopher, and I'm not an expert in neuroscience or psychology. I'm just someone that pays attention to where ideas end and not just where they begin. And today I want to talk to you about something that genuinely bothered me, not intellectually, but morally. The idea that free will doesn't exist. I was watching another episode of Star Talk, which I usually enjoy. I respect Neil deGrasse Tyson. I think he's an incredible science communicator, and I've learned a lot from him over the years. But in this particular episode, a guest made a very strong claim that free will doesn't exist at all. That everything we do is simply biology and chemistry playing out, and that none of our choices are actually choices. Before I go any further, I want to be very clear and very fair. What was being discussed in that episode is not a scientific conclusion, it's a philosophical position. And that distinction matters. Philosophy is about ideas, about interpretations, about frameworks for understanding the world. It does not establish truth the way science does. It does not run experiments, and it does not measure outcomes. It asks questions, proposes answers, sometimes brilliant ones, but they remain interpretations. So when someone says free will doesn't exist, they are not reporting a discovered fact. They are saying, this is how I interpret human behavior. One thing the guest said really stuck with me. He mentioned that he's been convinced free will doesn't exist since he was 12 years old. I want to say this carefully because it's not an insult, but a belief formed at 12 years old is not an argument. At 12, the human brain is not fully developed. Parts responsible for long-term reasoning, impulse control, moral judgment, and complex abstraction are still forming. That's not an opinion, that's neuroscience. So saying, I believe this since I was 12, does not strengthen the claim, it weakens it. It just tells us when the idea appeared and not whether it's correct. Holding on to a belief for a long time doesn't make it true. It just means you've held on to it for a long time. What troubled me wasn't the philosophy itself. It was how quickly it was accepted and who agreed with it. Well, who didn't challenge it enough, in my opinion. Because Neil deGrasse Tyson is not just a guy with an opinion. He's a respectable public intellectual. Millions of people listen to him, trust him, and take his words seriously. And when someone with his level of credibility nods along to the idea that free will doesn't exist, that has consequences, whether intended or not. Because if free will doesn't exist, responsibility begins to dissolve. Accountability becomes shaky, and moral effort becomes meaningless. And people watching don't hear this is a philosophical position. They hear science says you had no choice. Let me be clear about something. Biology matters. Trauma matters. Chemistry matters. Environment matters. None of that offends me. None of that is controversial. But influence is not the same as inevitability. Saying your past affects you is not the same thing as saying you cannot choose. And saying your brain is involved is not the same as saying you are powerless. The moment we erase that distinction, we erase agency. I know free will exists not as an abstract idea, but as lived reality. Because I've had every reason to become bitter, every reason to become cruel, every reason to give up responsibility. And I didn't. That wasn't chemistry. That wasn't inevitability. That was choice. Repeat it consciously. If free will didn't exist, then moral effort wouldn't exist either. And I see and live moral effort every day. This episode isn't about philosophy. It's not about dismissing science. It's about being honest what claims are and what they're not. If you want to believe that free will doesn't exist, that's your right. But finish the thought. Be fair and ask what disappears when you do. Because ideas don't just live in our heads. They shape how we treat people, how we judge actions, and whether responsibility still means anything at all. So in this episode, I just wanted to talk to you about free will. Talk to you about the idea that it doesn't exist. Talk to you about how dangerous it is for people to go around saying that. And don't get me wrong, philosophy is a good thing. I think it's important for people to think about stuff, but know that philosophy is not science. There is no claim and no evidence for anybody to think that free will doesn't exist. Yes, it's your right to think so if you want to, but free will, if it didn't exist, there would be no agency, there would be no accountability whatsoever. And that would make things morally complicated. You understand that, right? You have to choose to be a good person. I choose to be a good person. That is my choice. I made that choice consciously. My brain, I chose. And free will does exist. Because if it doesn't, you not only take away moral choice and responsibility and accountability, but you also take away effort, moral effort for somebody that chooses to be better. So that's dangerous. It's dangerous to think that free will doesn't exist because that gives people a reason to think that whatever they do, whatever they supposedly chose or didn't, has no real consequences because they can't have any consequences if you didn't choose it in the first place. If everything is biology and neuroscience and psychology, then why are people in prison? Because if they're not accountable, then they should get help, not punishment. That makes no sense. And there's one place where this conversation gets uncomfortable, and I want to approach it carefully. Addiction, because this is often where people say free will can exist, addicts don't choose. And here's the thing, I agree with part of that. Once addiction takes hold, control changes. The brain adapts, chemistry shifts, cravings override reason. That's real. I'm not denying that. But acknowledging that does not require us to erase the beginning. The first time matters. The first time wasn't compulsion. The first time wasn't dependence. The first time was a choice. Influenced, pressured, maybe even desperate, but still a choice. And saying that does not mean I lack compassion. It means I respect reality. People don't make choices in a vacuum. Trauma influences us, poverty influences us, environment influences us. But influence is not ownership of your will. If we say the first choice never counted, then we're saying nothing anyone ever does counts. That doesn't help addicts, it doesn't help recovery, and it doesn't help responsibility. In fact, it takes something away. The very idea that recovery is built on, which is the belief that you can choose differently now. And here's the paradox nobody talks about. If free will never existed, then recovery makes no sense. Growth makes no sense. Change makes no sense. We don't tell people in recovery, you have no agency. We tell them, you do. We say one day at a time, one choice at a time. That only works if choice is real. Me, myself, in my case, I've been offered escape. I've been offered numbness. I've been offered substance more times than I can count. And I said no, not because I'm special, but because I chose to be present. That choice didn't make me better than anyone. It just proves that choice exists. This isn't about blame. It's about honesty. We can hold compassion and accountability at the same time. We can say addiction exists without pretending agency never existed. And we can care deeply about people without lying to them. Because telling people they never had a choice doesn't help them. It doesn't free them, it traps them. So, yes, I'm not saying addiction isn't real. I'm saying they had a choice the first time around. And that choice matters. So, without that choice and saying free will doesn't exist, you take away agency and you take away blame. I'm not saying blame them. I'm saying they had a choice in the first place and they chose to do that. I'm not saying it was an easy choice. I'm not saying that they weren't pressured or whatever. I'm just saying they had a choice. So, yes, free will does exist. It has to. Because what people don't talk about and what's so fucking important is the fact that if free will didn't exist, neither would agency, responsibility, or accountability. You get that, right? Those things don't go together. You can't not have free will and have accountability. That doesn't make sense. So, when you talk about this, be honest. Finish the fucking thought. So, I want to say this. If free will doesn't exist, neither does agency. If agency doesn't exist, then responsibility doesn't exist. And if responsibility doesn't exist, then accountability doesn't exist. You don't get to remove choice and keep meaning. You don't get to erase free will and then talk about justice, recovery, growth, and change. Those things come as a package. You don't take one and pretend the others can survive on their own. And if we really believe that people have no choice, then we also have no right to praise courage, no right to demand better, and no right to expect anyone to rise above anything. That's not compassion, that's giving up on people. And I don't want to do that. I believe choice exists, even if it's hard, even if it's unfair, and even if it costs something. And I believe that because I see it every day, sometimes in others and sometimes in myself. Free will isn't denial of biology and trauma. It's the space, however small, where we decide who we're gonna be anyway. This episode wasn't about denying suffering. It was about refusing to let suffering decide everything. Because when we actually finish the thought, all the way to the end, what we're left with isn't hopelessness. It's responsibility. And responsibility is the beginning of meaning. I want to end this episode with a quote that stuck with me because it puts into words something I believed for a long time. It's not about religion for me, it's about responsibility and about what happens when we let suffering turn into justification. Jordan Peterson said this: "You think things are bad just because they're bad. Just wait until you see how bad things can become if you allow yourself to be corrupted by your unjust suffering." I do think that this is the most practical advice that can be given to people, which is that you are morally required to maintain faith, aim up, and treat people the way you want to be treated, no matter what's happened to you. That's not philosophy to me, that's a choice. And it's one I make every day. Thanks for listening. My name is Angela Sangash. Let's finish the thought.